Max, are you good? Plan: the United States should make voting compulsory. The GOP is actively engaged in a war on minority voters. They've gutted the Voting Rights Act and doubled down on felony disenfranchisement. Anderson 18. Minority voters did not just refuse to show, pushed by the impending collapse of the party, which constituency becoming a smaller share of the electorate. The GOP enacted measures to block the access of minority voters to the ballot. GOP harassed, obstructed, frustrated, and purged citizens, robbing the state of target socioeconomic characteristics of the people that so the new laws racially neutral justification after reconstruction plan is to transform the schemes of the laws that would ensure no African American efforts to real political restrictions imposed by the Mississippi Bill were enormously affected by 1940. Only 3% of age eligible blacks voted. The force of the voters' pressure used to arrest the right wing, go to the Voting Rights Act, and double down on felony disenfranchisement and litany of structural factors prevent minority turnout, voter ID laws, few polling places, election administration, and cynicism. Evenco 6-1. Obstacles to voting are higher. Nearly 1/3 of eligible voters in the U.S. are not registered. Eligible voters need to be kept from voting. 4 states of voter ID laws IDs can be acceptable to obtain CRT polling places, make voting more difficult, time consuming, such as fortunately harms minority voters. So elected participants should put their thumbs up skills for their own party's benefit. In 2018, Brian Kemp was able to oversee his own election, probably voter suppression, all adds up to citizens not voting. Compulsory voting is break through citizens to disrupt long-standing patterns of exclusion. Compulsory voting forces legislators to reverse voting obstacles, reorient politics towards vulnerable groups and solves political polarization. J19. Compulsory voting would incentivize legislators to lower the perceived voters with full participation in such a reform curve. Voter suppression citizens below local income, education, and elected to vote perceived as individual choice. Reality, there is a disenfranchisement mechanism. Many citizens who do not vote because they do not perceive the government as responsive. Public officials reinforce this perception by prioritizing the collective voters over non-voters. Communities without norms of voting face problem collective action. Compulsory voting remedies collective action problem. Universal turnout reorient the political system to be responsive vulnerable groups in Australia. The law established permissible reasons for not voting, such as illness, storm, travel, procedures, long citizens facing fights to challenge the court voter turnout. Average 95% in Australia just how laws can transform political culture. 87% in Australia said they would definitely vote if it wasn't mandatory. This just voted on genuine reason to vote. We said it's not an obligation to vote. Same local election obligation to make voting as easy as possible. States to reverse a decades-long trend. American policy has increased and incentivized politicians, gerrymander, and soliciting interference for foreign countries' actions threatening our health and voter democracy. Compulsory voting could reverse polarization. Compulsory voting could have more than a quarter of the population of the electorate, permanently depolarizing American politics. Compulsory voting solves the root causes of low turnout, reduces negative tone of campaigns, makes politics less divisive, increases representation. Harvard Law 17. 7. The increasing voter turnout from compulsory voting laws has established consistent elections more representative actually change policy outcomes in ways that reflect accurate preferences. Compulsory voting reduce money politics. Parties not spend as much on the get out the vote. Efforts 5. G7 would shift some funds to issue ads with diminishing marginal effectiveness. These would limit this. Politicians like the old new donors. Compulsory voting increase political awareness and change the parties to develop campaign strategy. Compulsory voting lead to fewer negative campaigns featuring ad attacks because such attacks would succeed by lowering turnout among targeted groups. Compulsory voting bringing new population play. First, political actors take these voters into account. Compulsory voting is substantial to alleviate causes low levels of turnout. Compulsory voting force politicians to their different sets of issues. People who presumably find government agenda just their interests. Compulsory voting unequivocally increases turnout representation even when there's no enforcement to if there's little doubt such a reform would increase turnout, making the election more represented. Countries with compulsory voting turnout 10 to 15 point higher. Laws increase turnout with penalties non-participation over. Laws help to reinforce the normal voting even though there's no enforcement. Compulsory voting ensure elected representative citizens. Something does not occur with the purpose to turnout. This forces parties to take account of preferences otherwise ignored. The voter suppression keeps an endless cycle of exclusion, produces policies that harm voters who cannot vote, and makes coronavirus worse. 413 impotence voting is especially offered disadvantaged groups support policies to promote their health. Policies undergird structural rights and those original rights to research all racial groups, power, and health are interconnected. Voters starting to consider determining health because it shapes who selection policies impact people to vote. Risk their living conditions. 13 states have voted on deciding that expanding Medicaid benefits. Voter suppression may enforce adverse health policies that stop health insurance. Some identifies non-white may be more vulnerable to come to know the act of voter suppression itself and the policies that produces deteriorate health conditions. 6 19. Policies are disproportionate and detrimental to exclude voters, restrictive voting, diplomacy, wielding marginalized groups, advocating for the concerns, including health, education, immigration, transportation, environmental policies, democracy, Georgian gubernatorial race, which voted rolls of 53,000 people, 80% were voters of color, temporary voting abortion after 6 weeks. Georgia has the highest rate of maternal mortality in the country. Maternal mortality disproportionately affects women of color, just enriched from civil medical spaces, suppression, exacerbate climate change, support crime, dismantle safety net programs, individuals being forced to live in areas of environmental and negative consequences for health, disenrichment includes the social and low control. Associated cardiovascular disease, depression, exclusion may diminish social cohesion, impact well-being, empowerment, forward to improve health. 29% of blacks believe their vote will not be counted compared to only 8% of whites. Third voting may contaminate discrimination, lead to psychological distress, toxic contribute to psychological distress, affects discriminatory conduct, accumulating ambiguity, structures of rumination, how responsibility, anticipated future interaction, acute structures transform the chronic structure, negatively impact cardiovascular, endocrine, immunological systems, believe it distress, engage coping behavior, stress may emerge through psychological processes, increase allostatic load, may amplify environmental exposure, voter suppression manifests in hate crimes, violence, counter result in immediate impairments will also like the extreme start for long hours from degree asthma and 3 so health disparity can reinforce voters for premature mortality experience for African Americans translated to 1 million Blackfoot's lost in 2004 6 processes are situated within a hostile racial climate structured by structural stigmas who grow to represent millennials who can and cannot vote created stigma for those who can't negative measures accepted by the individual associated increased metabolic cortisol secretion depressive symptom beverages will submit associated increased mortality with society characterized by racial disparities motive constitutes stressor which would intensify racial health disparities framing. Prioritize people who are alive today, intergenerational obligations, complicated uncertainty, and non-identity, and 11. We might not be able to make predictions of the consequences of present action circumstances might change in a way render harmful, but 9. We cannot be certain the certain uranium will harm future people since future knowledge might reveal better storage abilities. Obligation fairly allocate research among present claimants are called in question by uncertainty. Resources subject judgments will be viewed in instrumental human welfare changes. Undermine status of any good seen as subject to such principle. Uncertainty objections apply with less force in the near future when destructive situation exists in the near future is untenable. Policies undertake now to affect the identities of person to be more parental parents that yield opportunity wretched by one is set in the we cannot say present actions harm particularly future person may owe their existence such actions with generation work one environmental disposition cannot say broken harms any future person. These persons might never have been born under alternative. We cannot link our future harms deferred by particular person some wrong present action. We cannot say the action harmed anyone, minimizing suffering always promoting future happiness, guaranteeing creating happy beings, thus morally healthy, making sure existing beings are well off. Imagine 2 plants, 1 empty, 1 happy, 1,000 beings suffering in the empty planet. Even if I bring 1 million beings into this and will the happy life, trying to the happy being help with that has similar things, even though one could be about 100 sometimes as many happy beings as existing unhappy ones, moral and happiness, healthy and happy beings and separated promotion of happiness, actual beings, their happiness and potential peers. Okay.
Good for 6. You didn't read the Walls evidence, right?
No.
Okay. Okay, sure. Your which piece of it? Yeah, your Levenko evidence isolates structural factors, a lot of them, that prevent sort of voters that cause voter suppression of the status quo. Insofar as the only mandate of the plan is compulsory voting, how do you decisively get rid of these?
So I think the Che evidence below is pretty good on this question. It talks about how compulsory voting would necessarily be accompanied by sort of reforms that make it so that everyone is able to vote.
Why? Like, that's an assertion, not a warrant.
Sure. So the Che evidence says it would incentivize legislators to lower procedural hurdles to full participation to curb voter suppression.
Wait, 1 sec. Why? You're sort of the top of the 1AC isolating power now is like passing policies that oppress minorities. Insofar as the crux of the 1AC is predicated on the idea that marginalized populations coming out and vote are going to hurt the GOP and create progressive policies, why would the government, which is sort of controlled by this sort of revisionist GOP type mindset, why would it ever get rid of these reforms to sort of allow the effects of compulsory voting to sort of...
I think it's kind of implicit within the mandate of compulsory voting. It would require legislators to make voting easy because everyone would be required to vote.
Is that a mandate of the plan?
We defend the plan text.
Like, you're in a double bind here. You don't solve your app or your extra topical. Do you, like, mandate the sort of elimination of these, like...
We defend the plan text.
Sure. So, to win any sort of solvency, you need to overcome these barriers, and you've made arguments as to why just a logical consequence of the plan is that these barriers disappear.
So it's not really the logical consequence, rather the way it would be implemented would be that it would necessitate getting rid of barriers to voting, such as like voter suppression.
But your evidence talks about incentive structures for policymakers to pass these laws who leverage increased turnout. Can you point me to a line in your evidence that indicates the mechanism of the affirmative is one that sort of decreases the structural barriers?
Sure. Again, the Che evidence line is where citizens have an obligation to vote. State and local legislators have an obligation to make voting as easy as possible, encouraging states change the presumptions in favor of broad access to voting, encouraging states to reverse a decades-long trend.
Sure. Your Anderson evidence indicates that sort of the war on minorities is fostered and conducted by the GOP if, like, the app successfully transferred governmental power to Democratic candidates. Would that resolve your impacts?
No. Like, I don't really understand the question.
Okay, I feel like you've isolated a causal relationship between GOP power and minority oppression. Would sort of ceding power to more liberal candidates...
It's just uniqueness for our argument. Like, that's the reason why voter suppression is happening now. Like, it doesn't make a claim about, like...
It's foreign case. I'm sending the doc. I guess we'll see. NC should be uploaded.
Wait, are you sending it in the email chain?
Oh, I never got the email chain. Or actually, I wonder. Actually, yes. I just, apparently sometime between the start of the 1AC and cross-X, I got the email.
Yeah, do you mind sending it?
I was gonna say, like, maybe we shouldn't open that because of the crash thing, but it seems as though it could. But yeah, I'll reply to the email with the doc. Let me know, or I just wait for people to reconnect.
Hello? Am I back?
Yeah, you are. Sorry about that. I think the file sharing has some sort of bug.
Yeah, you kind of just kicked me out of this room. I opened up your file and then, I don't know, just kind of booted
Yeah,
it.
that keeps happening. I think, like, email chain.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Is everyone good for the 1MC?
I'm just opening the doc.
For sure.
I'm good.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, great. First off, interpretation of democracy is a generic indefinite singular that may not defend a subset of democracy, making voting compulsory. The indefinite article A modifies the singular noun democracy in the resolution, which makes an indefinite singular CCC. The article is an indefinite singular used to refer to an unspecified count that people makes a great handicap for all members of the class. And the upward intelligent test and that verb test determination genericity of an indefinite singular Leslie 16. Genericity is just using indefinite singular C type or strike. These can also express as existential claims, generic specializations over individuals, and the existential upward and telling the same will be true if we place a more inclusive term than other test concerns whether we can insert an adverb of quantification with minimal change of meaning it applies to a democracy when it's the upward entitlement test and a democracy voting ought to be compulsory doesn't entail in a democracy voting ought to be compulsory because it doesn't mean that compulsory voting in dictatorship and two advertising in a democracy voting usually ought to be compulsory doesn't mean anything substantially different from the resolution violation. They only defend the United States voting vote negative one limits 113 countries that are arguably democratic. There's no universal since it has a different political situation and voting is compatible with non-democratic countries and broad definitions between negative preparation and possibly U20. Full democracies are 22, flood 54, 137, and choose the TDA with the evident advantage the whole West face no solve is absurd the net credential abuse justifies the acting flat enough to which leads to raise their abuse for technicalities of voting sure this should be evaluated through competing interpretations that tells negative that you do not have to prepare for reasonability. These are arbitrary, unpredictable, and fighting race at the bottom and will then elect your offense and no OPS is your room to be fair and chase every and win for answering currency pretty defense on and encourages theory and precision always and fails justifies the effort which really checks in rules of resolution that would to text negative ground preparation because that's no later about the resolution. Second off, interpretation of violation topic of democracy. So those listen to the EU democracy index is full democracy. US and TF insert a list of T democracies in the Dolphin democracy index. Always it comes from all the geopolitical policies that find the ground at the top of for one limits only full democracies draw a clear line of top of the last anything was arbitrarily exposed on the 113 nations which strikes us every negative ground and engagement. Yeah, U20. Full democracy 22, flood 54, 37, and two topic literature, full democracy is the most germane to the value question on the topic EU20. Full democracy is political freedom, civil liberties, respect and political culture, conducive to flourishing democracy, the functioning government is satisfactory, meteor, interpreted diverse effective checks and balances, judiciaries, interpreted independent and enforced. These are only limited problems. Third off. The Loyola Invitational is coordinated from stolen land in the Los Angeles basis inhabited by the Tongan people sustained by Spanish settlement in 1771, marked by a 7-decade period of colonial resistance sustained by Tongan chiefs such as Troy Parida, but despite their unity, this unified indigenous effort, a series of treaties signed in 1851 removed Tonga from their ancestral land, thus it is the responsibility of settlers to tie their politics to places the baseline for decolonization. L20. Decolonization is not easily done framework that centers indigenous life and epistemology because it's vitally important to recognize local settler colonial context in which we are situated right. We are on unceded Haudenosaunee and Mississauga land. We do not seek this to signal alliance with the Anishinaabe people. We state these words in recognition of sovereignty. There's no escaping complicity. We have responsibility to honor the indigenous laws of land. Those who are not indigenous to Turtle Island must recognize the responsibility of the land is due its indigenous knowledge to the starting point for decolonization. And their framing of structural violence offers token recognition that empathy to alleviate settler anxiety to consolidate their co-social capital. This concludes decolonial politics by continually investing in settler recuperations. Later 16. What wants to care for hearing for others and to be the model in the settler liberal concept vote is good for life and a healthy subject students have. Righteous sense of what social issues are important, deserving everything care. The ethical translates into certain rules or resolutions referred to this as by political morality, forms of power, and controlling people's existing every level experiences, subjectivity demonstrates some of the same forms seem better than nothing inside sensing anxiety is sensitivity, anxiety around how to engage with indigenous issues, taking apart and for investigating politics of the other day, or the good white person asks what can we do too often the effect is we imagine that we know what problem is in it, like any government must find solutions. Indigenous people are vulnerable and cares for from acts of benevolence and welcome indigenous people and already determined future. And settler colonialism is the permitting structure of the nation state which requires the elimination of indigenous life, land, the occupation of settlers, the appropriation of land, turns natives into ghosts and chattel slaves into access labor. That's tucking in 12. There's no separation between metropolitan colony who has in the settler colonial state regard for the appropriation of indigenous life and land. Settler colonialism exists and settlers sovereignty over all things supposedly live and held not due indigenous decolonization, disruption of indigenous relationships and land represent epidemic violence. The violence to research the settler colonial structure not an event. The land is remade into property for settlers to make the home indigenous people once we get ghosts and settler colonials and false shadow slaves who are kept landless and slaves the desirable commodity the person under these murder will kill keep and kill the slave makes them also the settler imagination the shadow slaves versus access slave but they can never be paid in the form of land colonial subject displaced by they sort of colonial settle indigenous land settlers a diverse racialized global relation complicate decolonization metaphor of people who are very contradictory decolonial desires to translate colonization to any track for liberation, and thus the only alternative is one of decolonization, tucking in 12. Incommensurate building settles and distance reconciliation motivates moved into reconciliation of concerns will happen after decolonization. Decolonization for the self-these questions do not perhaps cannot be answered for decolonization to exist in a framework. Decolonization is like accountable to settler future. Decolonization accountable to indigenous future. The answer is not fully in view as long as decolonization remains fluctuated by matter. But we'll find out it is as we get our incommensurability needs for alien to machine settler future removing gas to extent under settler innocence native futures and bring possibility to be possible by incommensurability decolonization not and is an elsewhere. Fourth off. Counterclaim in the United States voting should be compulsory for those who are not indigenous to Turtle Island. Imposing compulsory voting on indigenous populations is a coercive strategy of assimilation by the settler state, endorsing the lesser of two evils without genocidal system, ratifies that system legitimacy, which factors decolonial mobilization, indigenous action, media 20. Voting is harm reduction is never the hour harm is actually calculated. We can how many indigenous people live in important outcomes, race factor, and vitalize mind, damn sacred seconds, the desecration, compare sexual violence, statistic, prominent parties, all pledge allegiance to the soul, and lands harm reduction was appropriate to coerce others to engage in the theater from office and voting, never be a survival strategy to defeat and victim of marginal reforms can be easily reversed. There is nothing intersectional but participating in a genocidal system. Voting imposed with full solidarity. Voting is harm reduction is a pacifying language of the police movements. Voting is not a strategy of decolonization. Genealogy, the data vote is tied to boarding schools and assimilation. Citizenship would forward its colonial strategy to kill the Indian and save the man. They are not hoping for inclusion. Sovereignty is the paramount concern. And democracy, individual indigenous voting will be the mercy of political allies. Consolidating the native bloc is talking control. The native vote also seeks to reproduce native politicians to assimilate with the familiar face. Indigenous peoples of colonial power structures. Decolonization is fulfillment and centering indigenous demands is the nexus question of your ballot. Only by seeing the question of what should we do to the jurisdiction of native scholars can the one see providing ethical course of action. That's Carlson 16. Relational accountability be the word cornerstone of studies indigenous people have been speaking for a long time. Resistance to render this the last ethical theory that acknowledges the limitations of settlers' goals without allowing with indigenous population in place is the ethical demands of settlers, including the demand we refuse to repower an academic voices to marginalize indigenous resistance. We consider indigenous resistance in our work of work is no foundation in indigenous scholarship or studies review. We've problematic. The case page. Voting is regained the root cause of low turnout is the political recognition that marginalized populations do not have power over settler state regardless of turnout, not material barriers which non-unique the affirmative and centering the cause of structural violence around the GOP prevents us from recognizing the root cause of that violence. Settlerism is a structure. That was our indigenous action media adage, which A means all of their impacts are inevitable, and B functions as an external link to the 1AC due to the representation of conservatism as being sort of the root cause of oppression for minorities. And portraying minorities as marginalized due to lack of engagement with the state is settler paternalism, representing integration into the settler political as a means of escaping oppression is an assimilatory tactic straight out of Andrew Jackson's toolbox, which is another link to the 1AC. And voting suppression is a structural feature of the settler state. We cannot tolerate foreign perspectives, which means voter reform evidence is tagged as a logical consequence of the plan, not a band-aid. So if we in the state doesn't give a shit about black or native people, these obstacles stay in place and undo the case. This is really important because cross-sex was embarrassing for them on this issue insofar as they have made the claims that sort of the GOP holds power right now, and they have no motivation to give that up because they're sort of endorsing settler mindsets, sort of eliminating natives. That means there's no possible way the plan can solve for existing barriers. Skip to the last part on the case page. Compulsory voting is no impact on inequality. Dallas spoilers in Muskova and Cobell 15. Benefits of equal voice with internal under compulsory race by invalid votes. Ecuador in 2009 elections, 1/4 invalid, 1/4 of state. Has voters negative effects on the legitimacy of elected authorities. Voters are less likely to vote in accordance with these induces voter to favor parties further from no positions relative to voluntary voting. Catholic Court of voluntary voting. Good for cross.
Yeah. Okay, so status of the critique and the counterclaim.
Both condo. Actually, no. They're both dispo. Do you want the condition?
Yeah.
Okay, so there are three conditions. If you put defense on it, I can kick it. If you make a permutation, I can kick it. And if you straight turn both of them, I can choose one to go for. Basically, what that means is that if you straight turn one of the off-case positions, I have to go for it.
Okay, the critique, what parts of the app does the critique disagree with?
Quite a few. Do you want me to go through them?
Yeah, I do.
Sure. So we think sort of a failure to we think sort of the portrayal of the United States as an actor that can be ethical, the consolidation of the GOP as sort of the governing party that is causing harm now, and the idea that through reformism, through sort of minority and native engagement with the state, we can make things better. We think that that's sort of a coercive ruse where you're telling indigenous populations, hey, assimilate into the governmental bodies of those who have been oppressing you for generations.
Why does voting make people assimilate?
What? That was like all of the Indigenous Action Media evidence. You can go down to a highlighted line.
Okay, that's fine. Are there other links?
Yeah, and I can answer the other question in a minute because like.
Okay,
It's probably true. There's the structural violence link. That's our Slater evidence, where we indicate that sort of settlers' cohering care for population always exists in in sort of opposition to other things. For instance, if I prioritize sort of certain marginalized populations and focus my analytic lens of impact calculus around them, that's sort of in opposition to something else. The way the 1AC has framed it, as per sort of your like arguments, is that this is framed in opposition to the sort of prioritization of existential impacts. However, the Slater evidence makes the argument that your sort of prioritization of structural violence that the state can remedy is framed in opposition to the recognition of violence that the state cannot remedy because it is caused by the state.
Okay, are there other links?
Yeah, we think the sort of the Tucking Yang card makes a couple of claims. It makes the argument that like settlerism is a constitutive structure of settler colonial states, insofar as sort of settlers always wanting to claim indigeneity for themselves. Yeah, I think the link on so like the Indigenous Action Media evidence makes a couple of links. I've gone through most of those. The Tucking Yang evidence makes a couple of links. There's also sort of the delineation between sort of the settler slave native triad, which probably implicates the Ab's portrayal of marginalized populations. There's also the structural violence link, and then all of the links on case.
Okay, the alternative, what does it do?
We think settlers should completely repatriate sovereignty and jurisdiction over the land to indigenous populations. We've critiqued the idea of knowing how it will happen. Like, I'm going to assume, are you indigenous? Given that, like, I don't think either of us are indigenous, the whole point of repatriating sovereignty is that it is up to them to determine how it happens. Once they have power, they determine what happens with it. We think the idea that, like, the state would never do this. It's just sort of a Sorry, what?
I'm going to take that.
Okay, you're ready to take that.
Okay, I'll send it right now. Wait, Tristan, are you still on the email chain?
Yeah, I'm on the email chain. Did you send it out? Or you're about to?
I'm trying to find, I don't know, the doc that I just got didn't include you, but now I'll go back to the original.
Yeah, I didn't get Max's document if he sent it via email. I got it through the file share.
Okay, got it. Okay, I just sent the one. The order is going to be the case, the T arguments in order, the critique, the counter. I don't really know what I'm talking about.
Okay, let me download it.
Okay, I do not.
I have the 1 AR.
It is loading for me right now. Okay, I just got it.
Like brain right now.
You said it was TATIU case set call pick.
Wait, can you guys see me and hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. My screen is just like not really. Okay, the order is the case, T plural, I guess. I don't know how to call it. TEIU, the critique, the counterclaim.
Sure.
Is everyone good?
I'm good.
Voter suppression is high now, but the plan reverses the trend by ensuring access to the polls prevents mass racialized, psychological, and physical violence. The line by line group. The first two arguments we don't propose that the GOP is like the root cause of all structural violence. Rather, that taking this one action would be able to remedy the trend of voter suppression that's happening because of the GOP like suppressing votes. We don't say that it's due to a lack of engagement. Rather, the fact that they cannot engage in the first place and they literally are barred from voting now. The last piece of evidence is not specific to the U.S. We've read evidence that when voters are suppressed in the U.S., policies that are unfavorable to them or passed. That was our evidence about like the Georgia gubernatorial race, the T argument. Counterinterpretation. Democracy is a plural. Democracy is singular. Specifying is key to ask flexibility. Otherwise, ASP would have infinite picks because of how many democracies exist. It's also limited by functional limits. Only a few countries who are considered democracies don't have compulsory voting already. So those apps would be inherent, and there's only like a handful of apps that you could read. Your interpretation, the Leslie card is about bare plurals, which doesn't apply because democracy is not a plural in the first place. So there's no reason why this would apply. Picks are bad. It's not about whether they're good or bad, but the fact that your interp leaves apps arbitrarily vulnerable to picks is a bad thing, and it's bad for fairness. You should use reasonability. It's not arbitrary. It's the way all debates are resolved, and it's better than competing interests because competing interests causes a race to the top in substance. The next T argument, I meet the U.S. is an electoral democracy. 20 U.S. and electoral democracy. Yes, it's the best metric. FH 23 men in the world promote each year the more than 100 analysis. 30 advisors, the analyses, news, academic analyses, reports from NGOs, individual content, on the guard research, sources, definitive series of review meetings, rating for process, emphasize methodological consistent rigor, unraced analysis, news, and metrics of democracy is one included of the use improves topical debate compulsory voting in the U.S. is the topic. It's one of the largest countries that did not adopt compulsory voting. Largest literature base, no limits, exposure, functional limits, check the use reasonability, right line, particularly it prevents a risk to stop arbitrary application of rules, proving that the most eminent NGO considers the U.S. democracy if you're reasonable enough that you index is really bad. They don't actually have to fact check and it's not public who votes for the arguments. The critique. Framework our interpretations of the debate should be decided on whether the plan is a good idea. It means you should get to weigh the case of best for competitive equity and the interpreters unpredictable are often avoid slash and turns debate into monolith. Beacons are research explanation to provide the plan as well as case terms and always a critique significant looks and the science set up for an alternative. Explicit of buildings foreclose the possibility for conditions to improve the 0.1% risk their ontology claims are false means that you vote off permutation to do both. It's impossible to do the all without having compulsory voting because indigenous people are systematically excluded from the political process. the framing the system is improving. The history proves that we can solve good where self-determination, education assistance, Indian child welfare, hate crime laws, and Indian religious freedom act to prove that societal progress is possible even if there's still work to be done. There's no justification for psychoanalytical theory represented by Lacanian analysis of small propaganda and extension or particular cases dealt with only confirm the already formulated theory. Theories allowed examples already true. Like analysis becomes a way to avoid studying specific cases. There's no link. We don't say that the U.S. is an ethical actor. Just that this one reform would be good for improving voter suppression. It's not that they don't want to engage with the fact that they are systematically barred from being able to participate. There's a time frame solvency deficit too. The audit's too slow to solve for the impending election. Also, civil unrest is sad because where do people go and what happens to the government would cause massive unrest. The counterclaim. Condos of voting issues gives one flexibility to historical act, justice, debates, political right, creates like development, creates increasing matter of vote app for deterrence permutation do both. People can just abstain, and people can just abstain if they don't want to participate in the system. Also, there's a solvency gap because there's a bunch of other tribes in the US and it only sucks this one tribe. Voting is also good because it allows people to change policies in ways that help them.
What were your warrants for Conde Bad?
What?
What were your justifications for Conde Bad?
Skews one AR flexibility, which is the arc of clash. Depth is good debates, political value, creates like developing debates between moves to one AR.
Oh, okay. Any reason to reject the team other than Kondo?
No.
What was like the abstainment argument on the pick?
If they don't want, it's not forcing them to engage in the political process because they can just like abstain by sending in blank.
But voting is compulsory. How do you abstain?
What? You don't have to fill out your ballot.
Oh, wait, then what does the plan do? I'm confused. Like, if do you or do you not make people vote?
Yeah, people have to like go to the polling place and fill out a ballot, but they don't have to like. The government can't like make people like vote in the correct way. Like every year, there's a bunch of people who like mess up their ballots or like don't fill out their ballots. Like the plan doesn't take a stance on those instances.
That's And did you read the Durlick 98 card on set call?
No.
Okay. Okay. But the order is going to be the pick, then the critique. The order is going to be the pick, the critique, the two topicality shells, and then case. There's not a doc. Let me know when everyone's good.
The order of the two T shells is the first one, then the second one, right?
Yeah. It doesn't really matter. I'm just picking out of them.
Okay, cool. And you said there's no doc?
No doc.
Okay.
Everyone good?
I'm good.
Yes. The counterplan solves the entirety of the affirmative without coercing indigenous populations into voting. Not only have we impact turn forced native electoral participation, our indigenous action media evidence explains why the structure of settler democracy means the minoritarian native vote will never have influence on the behavior of political institutions. This was conceded and has two implications. Firstly, this serves as a link argument. Compulsory native voting is a ruse of consent. Settlers force natives to vote in the name of harm reduction, despite the fact that the native vote structurally cannot reduce harm in settler societies, and then they treat this sort of forced indigenous political engagement and quote-unquote endorsement of the state or of a certain candidate or system as consent to perpetuate that political system and engage in structural genocide. Secondly, this is terminal defense on any absolvency deficit. If native voting is structurally incapable of harm reduction because of the minoritarian position, then native exemptions do not affect absolvency because their vote cannot be instrumental in the sort of settler political change that the app uses to garner offense from this question. The question of this debate is not whether compulsory voting is good or bad. The nexus question, and for that matter, the only question of your ballot should we force indigenous populations against their will to engage in a political system that have perpetuated their extermination? We should not force natives to choose between high rates of sexual violence or really high rates of sexual violence, and we should not force natives to choose between quote-unquote sustainable nuclear power that poisons ancestral land or the next iteration of the Keystone or Dakota Access Pipeline that the GOP has coming down the pipe. It's try or die for a radical decolonial rejection of settler institutions that could potentially solve these sorts of instances of violence. And since the app's binaristic understanding of indigenous political engagement prohibits natives from endorsing this third decolonial option and dooms political movements to failure, they should be held accountable for the very material violence they describe as inevitable and therefore unworthy of attention, which gives us utilitarian net benefit. The line by line proper. I'll answer conduit at the bottom. The solvency deficit about how this is just one tribe, so I can't resolve my impact doesn't make sense. You should probably look up what Turtle Island is. It's not a specific tribe. It's an indigenous term for North America, which means the plan, which means the counter plan prevents compulsory voting for all indigenous groups on Turtle Island or North America, which is sufficient to solve my offense. They say voting is good for helping natives. One, voting is harm reduction, invest in flawed political institutions, and ultimately prevents the sort of structural change demanded by indigenous resistance. This was explained in the overview and was literally the thesis of our indigenous action media evidence. Their state can do good things. Answer doesn't apply because we agree the state can do good things. That's why the counter plan uses the state. We have indicted the specific nature of their policy and the sort of light it paints on the state as a unique reason to reject them. Second, the apps claims that the native vote can improve material conditions on reservations is boarding school logic that presumes settlers know what's best for native and are therefore entitled to infinitely infringe on native sovereignty. Even if they win, conditions could quote-unquote get better for natives that they had a voice in politics. That papers over the sort of infringement on personal and tribal sovereignty, which aren't necessarily quantifiable, but still incredibly relevant, which the app labels intangible and therefore irrelevant, which is probably a reason to drop them. And lastly, there's a jurisdictional claim in our Carlson evidence that when straight conceded. This will frame how you sort of evaluate all of the sovereignty deficits on the line by line. Frame your impact evaluation as a question of jurisdiction insofar as the 1AC is chosen to support a policy that not only affects indigenous populations but also mandates they take a certain action. They should be held accountable to the demands of indigenous scholarship. This operates on a higher layer than the affirmative impact, regardless of the consequential desirability of the plan. It's because you as a settler and the state as an institution lack the jurisdiction to determine the sort of act of sovereign indigenous populations without their consent. This is a practical question to the 1AC because their policy directly mandates action taken by indigenous populations, which means the last argument I have to answer on the pay flow is the permutation which doesn't make any sense. It's severance. The plan mandates compulsory voting for all citizens, excluding reasonable exemptions, which includes indigenous populations. Severance is a voter removes 7 minutes of NC offense and destroys clash by incentivizing the 1 year to delink out of our negative positions. They are heavily negative on the question of the counterclaim. 8 point is negative ground. It doesn't exist on this topic. Pepsi challenge for a coherent policy generic that can be read against most apps. And viewing natives as a competitive exemption to the plan, as sort of, if you viewing the native pick as a competitive alternative to the plan creates a more equitable division of ground than reject the permutation. And B point, this topic is incredibly vague. Compulsory voting would be construed to exclude it would sort of be construed to include a near infinite number of exceptions. They didn't lay out in the 1EC whatsoever that people could just like not sign their ballot and just show up to a polling station, because that is antithetical to the idea behind compulsory voting. Compulsory voting, and this isn't a permutation. This is a reason as to why it might mitigate some of our offense, but insofar as they concede this solves the entirety of the 1EC, even a risk of a net benefit and a risk of violating indigenous sovereignty is sufficient to vote nay. Condo. Counter-interpretation to the additionality is good as well. They're often take a set limit on the number of advocacy, which means they don't have to be an infinite combo. They don't have time to clash and counter-interpretation and maybe conditional advocacies. One is education, one experimentation. Lack of condo means the next I've never experiment with new arguments, which results in stale debate where you should raise in the same position every round. Viewpoint strategic thinking. Condo forces the 1 year to make time allocation decisions. The 2 just go through more layers when deciding where to collapse and C point. And 2 is fairness, actions, the advocacy, and infinite prep for all front lines and how 1 arrows next. Need to prep every app to ask and go deep on what on 1 or 2 apps condo balance this by allowing many options, and it's key to innovation. If I'm stuck with one counterplan or K, I have to go for every. If I'm stuck with one counterplan or K, I have to go for every round. And I'm never going to innovate. And innovation is the reason debate is good, because it's only the sort of portable education we get outside of the round. Use reasonability, competing interpretations leads to a substantive credibility, minor infractions, and the debate go. But after they have substantive answers, that proves the substantive voting on theory outweighs the abuse story. Look, they did not read DISPO, which means this is a question: should I read one advocacy or get 2 condo? They can't try to solve my offense. They say collapse, but 1 to 2 in our collapse souls. The 2 can focus on that advocacy and way against the app is already indexed against the status quo, so they just have to beat the advocacy. And 2 debates aren't long enough for anything more than scratching the surface, even without condo, which proves condo gets the best of both worlds with early breath and late breaking gap. And 3 turn condo increases breath and flash by incentivizing multiple layers like take advantage of CP, D, and case debate. Breath outweighs death on portability because debate exposes to more ideas. The Stratsky argument doesn't make sense. It's not a new yoke. All your arguments are conditional since debaters go for things all the time and not others. 1 year theory with no RBS, because we have condo offense as well. In turn, lack of condo debt, Rex neg strategy. The 1 year gets first and last words, and neg strategy outweighs.
Okay, taking the rest of Rob. Okay. The order will be the case, the counterplan. Is everyone good?
Yeah, I'm fine.
The plan ushers in electoral reforms that make suppression impossible and improve conditions for thousands of Americans. For thousands of Americans, it turns and outweighs the case on probability the GOP is actively gearing up to suppress votes in the election, and absent the act, they will be successful. They will be successful. This actively denies populations like Indigenous and Black communities any voice in politics and causes them psychological violence implicit in being excluded from the voting process. Also has like mass health implications for them, and causes massive amounts of suffering. Given the case was completely conceded, there's a high risk that the act solves some voter suppression and that it solves for some material change. They've not indicted our solvency whatsoever, which should heavily implicate the counterplan debate. The counterplan. Progress is possible, and a risk that the plan can bring about material change that improves the conditions and lives of Indigenous people means that you affirm. We've also indicted their ontology statements on the critique page. That was the Johnson like psycho indict, which means that progress definitely is possible. And any risk that the plan increases, any risk that the plan is able to help Indigenous communities is a reason for you to affirm instead of inflicting a bunch of psychological violence on them. The permutation does shield the link, and it's not severance. It's just a test of competition, and you don't. It's just a test of computation, and you don't compete. We'll explain the permutation here. The app only mandates that it's compulsory by law for people to vote, which means that people could still go to the polls and do things like write in, turn in blank ballots, or like spoil their ballots. That's explicitly stated in our Takaji evidence in the 1AC. Means that it's possible for us to have compulsory voting, and also people who don't want to participate in the political process to just not participate, which solves all of your offense, but also has a risk of improving the lives of Indigenous people. Voting is good. It's not an active we shouldn't view it as an active coercion, but rather giving people the opportunity to vote because they don't have it now. Things like voter purging and poll intimidation are objectively bad things, and a risk that the app solves them is good. It's morally repugnant to say that certain groups of people should not have the right to vote. That is just obviously incorrect and repugnant. Your argument, you've not made any argument that doing the app forecloses any future progress for Indigenous people, for Indigenous people, and you've not quantified sort of like the violence that it infringes on them. It doesn't infringe on their sovereignty. It actually does the opposite, because it gives them the ability to have sovereignty in the first place. You should weigh the consequences and material change, and definitely vote after there's any risk that it solves some violence.
Good debate.
Good debate.